Okay. Today we're going to dive into one of the most popular English novels of the 19th century.
So your teacher assigns you Jane Eyre, and these are probably some of your initial thoughts. Let's be honest.
Do they even make books this long? Who the hell is Jane Eyre, and what kind of lame-ass title is that? They say never judge a book by a cover, but I can already tell this is gonna suck. Ah, maybe the back will be better. The story's heroine Jane is a plain-speaking orphan, whose determination and spirit sees her through a series of personal ordeals from an early age. Yeah, okay, there's no way I'm sitting through 500 pages of this trash.
Okay, don't stress, that's what we're here for. Let's start with a summary and move on to an analysis. The novel begins with a mini 10-year-old Jane, and we are given a glimpse into her life at Gateshead Hall. Mr. Reed, Jane's uncle, took Jane in after both of her parents died of typhus. We're informed that Mr. Reed favored Jane, but died soon after. Now, poor little Janie is left to fend for herself, and is constantly tormented by a resentful Mrs. Reed and her three god-awful children, Eliza, John, and Georgiana.
Now, John is a 14-year-old cousin of Jane. The best way to describe him would be picture a 19th century version of Dudley from Harry Potter. In fact, imagine the brattiest, most self-entitled child, multiply that by 10, and ta-da, you have John.
Aren't they wonderful, darling?
How many are there?
36. Counted them myself.
36! But last year I had 37!
Well, I guess if you're going off Harry Potter references, then it would make sense to say that Mrs. Reed is an Aunt Petunia figure. She's insanely cruel to Jane, yet smothers John with affection.
Can you say Mama's boy?
Now, Jane is sitting quietly and reading a book on wildlife when John comes out of nowhere and demands that she not touch what belongs to the Reed family. Oh, we forgot to mention, the Reeds are extremely wealthy.
Now, in a heated moment between the two children, Jane strikes John and, well, we all know that can't be very good. See, now when most kids misbehave, it's normal that they get a timeout, which usually entails sitting in a corner for about 3 minutes. Jane, on the other hand, is locked away in what was known as the Red Room of Hell. No, I'm just kidding. It's called the Red Room, but it gets worse.
The room is described as cold and silent and was the place where Mr. Reed has drawn his last breath. So you can imagine how uncomfortable anyone would feel hanging out in some creepy ghost room.
Poor Jane, being scared out of her wits, screams in protest. However, the thought of being there with the ghost of her dead uncle is kind of unnerving, and she wakes in bed the next day ill, having been scared half to death.
This just in, Jane got out of the Red Room, but you already knew that. Alright, so it's clear Mrs. Reed views Jane as a problem child, so her and a man named Mr. Lowood suggest the brilliant idea that Jane be shipped off to a boarding school. Which boarding school, you ask? Lowood. Mr. Brocklehurst, the headmaster of the school, visits Jane at Gateshead. Her first encounter with him is pretty awful. Jane's lack of understanding of religious texts and her blunt distaste for psalms rubs Brocklehurst the wrong way, and he claims that she has a wicked heart.
Anyone else think Brocklehurst and Miss Reed should get together? Now, the school isn't much better than its headmaster. Jane is subject to constant malnutrition, poor living conditions, and abuse from many of her teachers. Most importantly, she befriends a girl by the name of Helen Burns. Helen's strong sense of self helped Jane through her time at Lowood, but unfortunately, Helen dies of consumption.
After having remained at Lowood for 8 years, Jane accepts a governess position at Thornfield, where she teaches a young French mademoiselle by the name of Eyre.
Let's get to the interesting stuff. The male lead of the novel, Rochester. See, now Rochester is kind of a Darcy-Heathcliff combination. Now, assuming you don't know what I mean by that, let me be more clear. Rochester has the benefits of an aristocratic title and a shit ton of money. At the same time, he is dark and secretive, and we just can't help but sense a romantic tension between Rochester and Jane.
You have no idea what it is to love. You have no idea what it is to feel the very beat of someone's heart within one's breast.
I'm sorry, do I look like a robot to you?
Now, with any love story, there has to be some form of conflict. Conflict number 1 comes in the form of Blanche Ingram. Nice name. Rochester makes it seem as though he wishes to marry her, but we later learn that Blanche was nothing but a gold digger.
Now I ain't saying she a gold digger.
when Rochester spread a false rumor that his fortune is not as large as she may have expected or rather hoped for.
Now, poor love-stricken Jane is convinced that he wants to marry Blanche, and that she'll be joining another family in Ireland. However, one night Rochester approaches Jane in the garden, and they declare their love for one another.
What if I want you right here by my side forever?
Your bride stands between us, sir.
My bride is here. Will you be my wife? Will you make me the happiest man on this earth?
I will.
Oh my god! Stop! So good news and bad news. Good news, they're gonna be married. Bad news, problem number 2 kicks in. So it's Jane's wedding day, and she's super excited to be marrying super rich and hunky Rochester. Just kidding. Jane doesn't care about stuff like that.
They make it to the church, and that's where things take a turn for the worst. Mr. Mason cries out that Rochester already has a wife. Mason introduces himself as the brother of that wife, a woman named Bertha. Mr. Mason testifies that Bertha, whom Rochester married when he was a young man in Jamaica, is still alive. And sadly, Rochester does not deny any of these claims. Nice one, Rochester. Now, old wife Bertha has apparently gone mad and lives in some sort of tower or attic where she is hidden from the world. How very gothic. We also learned that Mad-Eye Bertha was the real cause of the fire earlier on in the novel.
You'd think after the first fire, they would have kept Bertha away from flames. Like, seriously, how is she getting access to this stuff?
Bertha, who gave you that? Matches, Bertha? What the Bertha?
Depressed Jane flees Thornfield and is left penniless and hungry to roam the English countryside. But at last, 3 siblings who live in a manor called Marsh End take her in. Their names are Mary, Diana, and St. John, and Jane quickly becomes friends with them. St. John is a clergyman and finds Jane a job teaching at a school in Morton. He surprises her one day by declaring that her uncle, John Eyre, has died and left her a large fortune of £20,000. When Jane asks how he received this news, he shocks her by announcing that her uncle was also his uncle. Well, look how that worked out. Talk about a coincidence. Anyways, John decides to go and work as a missionary and asks Jane to travel with him as his wife. Jane declines. Nah thanks, I got something a little better waiting for me up at Thornfield.
In a supernatural moment in the text, Jane hears Rochester's voice calling her from across the moors and decides to venture one last time back to the man she truly loves. Jane returns to Thornfield to discover that it has been burnt to the ground.
Guess Bertha went a little crazy this time, and also lost her life in the fire. How convenient. Jane travels on to Rochester's new residence, Ferndean, where he lives with 2 servants named John and Mary. At this residence, Rochester and Jane fall madly in love all over again and, big surprise, finally married. At the end of her story, Jane writes that she has been married for 10 blissful years. She also tells the reader that after 2 years of blindness, Rochester has regained sight in one eye and was able to behold the sight of their firstborn son. Convenient.
Throughout the novel, Jane is subject to much ridicule, constantly ostracized due to her social standing, and she's financially dependent on Mrs. Reed, then Lowood, and finally Rochester.
Yeah. That's 10. Wasn't that enough?
Yes, sir. But you still owe me 5.
The Red Room is symbolic of Jane's social imprisonment and often reoccurs in Jane's memory. The Red Room is representative of the external factors she must overcome before she can marry her Prince Charming. It is not until Jane gains financial independence and finds her own sense of purpose that she can wed Rochester and find freedom in marriage. There are also constant references to fire. Jane is constantly associated with warmth, while Rochester is also linked to fire. Most specifically his eyes. After losing his eyesight to the flames, his face is described as a lamp quenched, waiting to be relit. This also connects Jane and Rochester as kindred spirits.
The Red Room kind of functions for Jane the same way Bertha does. I mean, other than giving the novel a gothic element of a woman hidden in a tower and moments of suspense, Bertha, although she may stand in the way of Jane marrying Rochester, she's also the factor that leads Jane to her self-discovery. Bertha also is sometimes read as a manifestation of Jane's fears of marriage. Jane never voices these concerns and instead internalizes them, but Bertha, on the other hand, a Victorian wife who married a wealthy aristocrat, not only expresses herself through acts of violence and anger.
One of the more obvious issues at stake is social class, and Bronte provides a critique of the aristocracy. These are especially evident through characters such as Mrs. Reed and Blanche, who only takes interest in Rochester for his money. Now, Jane is very well educated and Rochester's intellectual equal. In saying this, she also combats gender norms, yet she unfortunately still sits far below Rochester on the social hierarchy, and often wonders if someone as plain and little as herself is even worth marrying.
There is a moment in the text when Jane declares herself Rochester's equal, which, considering the time that this text was written, depicts Jane as a powerful female heroine.
I am your equal, and you have treated me as such. You have shown true respect for me.
Most importantly, Jane Eyre was published in 1847 and is considered one of the most influential novels of its time. Providing a social commentary on class, religion, morality, and gender, Jane strives to combat patriarchal ideals and the oppressive nature of aristocratic sensibility.
Now it's time for the lesson of the day.
Be wary of those crazy exes.
And remember, no matter where you get on the social scale, you can always marry out.
Well, that's all for now. See you next time on LitLove.